Hey guys, tonight we step into one of the strangest and coziest corners of military history. You're not marching across muddy fields or ducking from arrows. Instead, you're sliding into the belly of a steel whale, a submarine slipping beneath the waves in the middle of World War II. The air is already heavy with machine oil, recycled breath, and the faint metallic tang of seawater pressing against the hull. And then, of all things, you catch the smell of bread. Actual bread. Warm. Yeasty. Golden brown loaves being pulled from an oven 200 feet below the ocean's surface. You probably won't survive this mission if the enemy finds you. But at least you'll go down with the scent of dinner rolls in your nostrils. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling generous, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing the spread of night owls and insomniacs across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hatch clangs shut above your head, and already you feel the pressure of confinement. This isn't a cruise liner. The corridors are so tight that brushing shoulders is unavoidable, and you quickly learn the submarine shuffle, turning sideways, flattening yourself against the bulkhead, letting others squeeze by. Every inch of the vessel is claimed by pipes, valves, storage bins, and bunks stacked like coffins. Privacy doesn't exist here. Even thoughts feel too loud. And yet, threading through this claustrophobic maze, your nose keeps following something impossible, something homey. It's the galley, if you can call it that. A space no larger than a walk-in closet, wedged between machinery that hums constantly, threatening to drown out every other sound. Here, a cook stands, sleeves rolled up, sweat shining under a dim bulb, sliding a tray from a compact oven. The hiss of steam escapes as loaves reveal their crusty tops. You can almost hear the dough sigh, expanding in the relative freedom of this metal box. A loaf of bread on land is nothing remarkable. At sea, under the sea, it's a miracle. The U.S. Navy, the Royal Navy, even German U-boat crews all shared this secret luxury, despite living in one of the most hostile environments humans ever engineered for themselves. Sailors craved not just calories, but comfort. Bread carried memory, of home kitchens, of bakeries on street corners, of ordinary days that seemed impossibly far away. The funny thing is, the Navy didn't initially plan for such luxuries. At first, submarines were packed with canned goods, dehydrated meat, and the infamous hardtack, a biscuit so tough you could probably patch hull dents with it, but morale cracked faster than those biscuits. Crews muttered. Officers noticed tempers rising. And eventually, somebody figured out, if you can squeeze torpedoes into this tin can, surely you can squeeze in an oven. You can almost picture the first trials, chefs cursing as dough refused to rise in the weird humidity of a submarine. Flour dust clogging vents, officers demanding silence while a mixer clanged against the walls. But when it finally worked, when the first tray of golden bread came out at depth, something shifted. The crew quieted, calmed, as if the very presence of bread anchored them to sanity. Bread became more than food. It was a psychological weapon against despair. One sailor recalled that the smell of bread at night felt like a reminder that civilization still existed, even if we were hiding under the Atlantic. Another joked that fresh bread was more effective than rum for keeping men loyal to the captain. Historians still argue whether naval strategists fully understood this morale boost, or whether it was just a happy accident born of inventive cooks. And the irony? The submarine oven was right next to torpedo racks. Picture it, a deadly weapon designed to sink ships sitting a few feet from a pan of rolls destined to soothe stomachs. It's almost poetic. You can kill with one, comfort with the other, sometimes in the same shift. The bread wasn't perfect, of course. At sea, supplies were limited. Flour might get damp. Yeast sometimes acted strange in the recycled air, producing loaves that collapsed or came out oddly sour. One cook reportedly tried baking a birthday cake for the captain and ended up with something that looked more like a collapsed football. The crew ate it anyway, smothered in jam. Complaints? None. Humor became another ingredient in the recipe. But the smell. Ah, the smell. Imagine diesel fumes, machine grease, and sweat-soaked uniforms, and then, threading through that, a ribbon of warmth, crust, yeast, sweetness. It was enough to make men line up early for their shift meals, crowding the galley with eager grins. It reminded them that, even if the depth gauge ticked lower and the enemy destroyer prowled above, humanity hadn't been left behind. Bread had always been symbolic. Breaking bread with friends, loaves blessed in rituals, the staff of life. Here, underwater, it became an even sharper symbol. A loaf meant survival, morale, maybe even a lucky patrol. Some sailors said if bread burned, it meant bad luck for the voyage. Others swore that the first slice of the first loaf had to go to the captain, or the patrol would end poorly. Superstitions baked right in. And yet, there's a strange irony. The smell of bread could also be dangerous. Submarines prided themselves on stealth, silent running, hidden deep. But more than one captain fretted that strong aromas might leak when vents opened near the surface. Could the enemy sniff out a submarine by the scent of fresh loaves? Probably not. But paranoia is thick when you're 200 feet under. Sailors joked about German shepherds patrolling decks of destroyers, noses twitching for rye. Still, the ovens stayed, the bread kept baking. And down here, with metal groaning around you, depth charges always a possibility. You find yourself clutching a warm roll. It isn't just food. It's defiance. It's softness in a world built on steel and salt water. You edge deeper into the submarine, shuffling sideways past lockers stuffed with uniforms and bulkheads covered in pipes, until you reach the beating heart of domestic survival. The galley. Calling it a kitchen feels generous. It's more like someone crammed a diner counter into a phone booth and said, "Good luck feeding 70 men." The submarine galley is a marvel of cramped ingenuity. You can't stretch your arms fully without knocking something over. The ceiling presses low, and hot steam from pots coats the metal walls, turning them slick. The oven sits snug against the bulkhead, looking more like a stubborn filing cabinet than the soul of comfort food. Every surface is claimed, cutting boards balanced over sinks, mixing bowls perched on crates, knives magnetized to the wall. And yet, somehow, meals happen here. The cook, usually a petty officer, is the unsung wizard of this world. You notice his rhythm: shuffle 3 steps, pivot, grab a pan, duck as someone squeezes by, slide back, check the oven, all while the floor tilts with the roll of the sea, even at depth. His job isn't just technical, it's theatrical. Feed the crew, and morale rises. Slip up, and you'll hear complaints louder than the sonar ping. Historically, navies learned this lesson the hard way. In the early 20th century, submarine kitchens were barely equipped. Some boats had only a hot plate, others just a single burner. But as missions stretched longer, weeks, sometimes months, nutrition became vital. By World War II, submarines carried specialized galley designs, tiny but packed with function. One quirky tidbit? U.S. Fleet submarines were famous for some of the best food in the Navy, far better than what destroyers or battleships offered. It wasn't generosity. It was strategy. keep men confined in a steel tube too long, and you need every weapon against despair. Food became that weapon. You can almost hear the cook muttering as he wrestles with limited space. There's no walk-in freezer, no sprawling pantry. Flour and sugar sacks are jammed under bunks or stuffed in lockers. Every tin of beans is recorded on a ledger. Eggs are precious, stored in cushioned racks, and woe betide the sailor who cracks one by accident. The galley becomes a puzzle of logistics: how to rotate supplies, how to avoid waste, how to stretch fresh produce before it wilts in the damp air. One sailor once joked that the cook had the most dangerous job on board, not because of torpedoes, but because a bad meal might get him thrown overboard in mutiny. Humor aside, you sense the truth. Food in this environment is morale, health, and sanity tied together. Even historians admit it's hard to measure the exact psychological power of the galley, but many veterans insist it was as important as sonar. And honestly, if you had to choose between a fresh loaf and a radar blip at 2 you might hesitate. The galley itself holds quirks that feel almost absurd. For example, ventilation. Baking in an underwater tin doesn't come without problems. Heat and smell must be vented. But too much venting risks drawing in condensation or alerting anyone tracking exhaust on the surface. So cooks learned tricks: short bursts of oven use, clever positioning of fans. Sometimes even baking during moments when engines roared loud enough to cover the hum of activity. Imagine the scene. You're squeezed against the wall, trying not to get in the way as the cook pulls out trays. The glow of the oven is the only warm light in this gray corridor. Outside the galley, sailors crowd like kids outside a candy store. The cook shouts, "Don't hover, line up!" But nobody listens. The smell of yeast and butter has transformed this cramped submarine into something almost magical. Of course, not every attempt is a success. You recall hearing about a British crew who tried baking rolls during a storm. The boat pitched so violently that the loaves slid off trays, bouncing like rugby balls through the galley. The cook swore loudly, sailors cheered, and they ate the squashed bread anyway. Another tale tells of a German U-boat baker who mistook powdered milk for flour in the dark and ended up with a loaf that hardened into something closer to cement. Rumor has it the captain used it as a paperweight. You glance at the cook now, sweat dripping as he kneads dough on a cutting board that barely fits on the counter. His movements are quick, efficient, and strangely graceful in this tight space. It's like watching a dancer forced to pirouette in a closet. Each stretch and fold is muscle memory, honed not in culinary school, but at sea. The galley also doubles as a gossip hub. Men drift in, pretending to help, really just angling for an early slice. Conversations buzz, where the patrol is headed, who's snoring too loud in the bunks, whether the bread will come out crusty or pale this time. In this confined world, even the suspense of a loaf rising becomes a kind of entertainment. Sailors bet on it. Will it collapse this time? How many rolls before the flour runs out? It sounds silly, but in a world where days blur, bread becomes both a meal and a game. And yet, beneath the chatter, you sense a deeper reliance. The submarine is a war machine, yes, but it's also a fragile community. Every man depends on the others, on the sonar operator, the helmsman, the engineer, and yes, the cook. If one piece fails, the whole vessel suffers. And right now, the cook is succeeding. The smell of crust drifting through the submarine doesn't just fill stomachs, it fills hearts with a reminder. There's still softness in the world, even surrounded by steel and silence. Historians still argue whether navies truly understood the psychological science of feeding men under pressure, or if they just stumbled onto it by accident. Either way, you lean against the bulkhead, grinning as the cook wields his knife, slicing a steaming loaf into thick wedges, Plates clatter, voices rise, and for a fleeting moment, this submarine feels less like a weapon of war and more like a cramped little bakery lost at sea. You hold the warm slice in your hand, steam rising into the recycled air, and suddenly you feel the shift in the entire boat's atmosphere. The submarine, usually tense with the weight of silence and the steady hum of machinery, now hums with something gentler. Relief. You realize, with your first bite, why fresh bread down here means far more than just calories. It's about morale. Think about it. You're trapped in a steel cylinder under the ocean, depth charges above, the constant pressure of water pressing in like a fist. Your bunk is a coffin-sized shelf, your clothes are damp, and privacy is nothing more than turning your head away when someone changes socks. In that kind of existence, every small comfort swells to massive importance. A crusty loaf becomes a lifeline. The crews themselves said it outright. One American submariner recalled that a hot roll could make a man forget he hadn't seen sunlight in 30 days. Another said he could put up with broken showers and endless drills, but he couldn't stand a patrol without bread. Historians still argue whether bread actually increased combat effectiveness or just made men complain less. But honestly, when you're living underwater with 70 other sweaty humans, not complaining is already victory. The psychology is fascinating. Food isn't just fuel, it's memory. A bite of bread pulls you back to your grandmother's kitchen, to a bakery window on a frosty morning, to home. And when you're far from home, maybe facing the possibility of never returning, those memories become anchors. Soldiers on land had letters, photographs, sometimes leave. Submariners had none of that. Too hidden, too secretive, too deep. Bread became their postcard from normal life. And of course, the joke ran that submariners were spoiled compared to other sailors. On destroyers, meals often meant powdered potatoes and lukewarm coffee, while fleet submarine crews bragged of steaks, eggs, and, yes, fresh loaves. This wasn't just generosity, it was calculated. Yes, Navy officials believed better food could balance the psychological punishment of submarine duty. Germans, too, stocked their U-boats with dark rye, dense and sustaining, to remind crews of home. It's telling, isn't it? Amid all the technology, torpedoes, periscopes, sonar, the real morale weapon was yeast and flour. You chew slowly, savoring. Around you, sailors grin. For a brief moment, the ever-present paranoia lifts. Bread, you realize, also serves as a kind of glue. It binds the crew together, not just physically feeding them, but emotionally tethering them. A submarine is a team sport. There's no room for loners or sulkers. Sharing a loaf is more than politeness. It's survival, and humor sneaks in, too. Someone cracks a joke. "This loaf's so good it deserves a medal." Another pipes up. "Only if it survives torpedo practice." Laughter ripples through the mess. Down here, laughter is as scarce as sunlight, and bread seems to summon it like magic. Quirky tidbit? In some boats, the first slice of a fresh loaf was ceremonially given to the captain, as though he were the high priest of yeast. Other crews flipped the tradition. The captain always got the last slice, after everyone else had eaten. These customs weren't written in any manual. They just appeared, born of cramped boredom and superstition. Some sailors swore the voyage would be cursed if bread was sliced the wrong way. Imagine risking life under depth charge attack, and the thing you fear most is someone cutting diagonally instead of straight. But it worked. The ritual made everyone feel part of something. You can see it now. The loaf on the table, hands reaching, crumbs scattering, men elbowing each other with mock ferocity. It doesn't look like war. It looks like a family dinner crammed into a closet. Bread also had a funny effect on discipline. Officers could scold, issue orders, bark reminders. But when the cook brought out bread, even the strictest chiefs softened. Sailors said that a captain with a warm roll in his hand was twice as reasonable. Whether that's true or not, you can picture it. A hardened officer loosening his grip on protocol because he's distracted by butter melting on a crust. One story floats through your memory. A Schuetz sub patrolling the Pacific ran dangerously low on supplies. Tempers frayed, men argued, then, one night, the cook found just enough flour for a final batch. He baked rolls and handed them out in the mess. Silence followed. Chewing, nodding, the kind of silence that's heavy with gratitude. The crew swore that single meal pulled them through the last days of the patrol. Historians still debate whether such stories are exaggerated, but sailors swear by them. And honestly, who's going to argue with a man who's survived months in a tin can? You glance at the loaf again, crumbs dusting the steel table. The air smells alive now, masking the ever-present tang of diesel. You feel steadier, calmer. Bread hasn't just filled your stomach, it's patched up the cracks in your nerves. Down here, morale isn't built with speeches or medals. It's built one loaf at a time. The irony? Back home, people barely noticed. Civilians rationed bread, grumbled about shortages, and maybe rolled their eyes at military budgets. Few realized that somewhere beneath the waves, men risked their lives not just for missions, but for the promise of another role tomorrow. You realize that war isn't just about bullets and bombs, it's about the quiet things, the rituals that keep people human in the middle of chaos. You wipe your fingers on your trousers, glance around the mess, and know with certainty, tonight, the submarine will sleep easier, not because the sea is safer, or the mission is over, but because the galley produced another miracle. Bread has done what no commander could, brought calm to a crew on the edge. You push past the mess hall, following the lingering scent of crust and yeast, and end up in one of the least glamorous corners of submarine life: storage. Here is where the real magic of bread begins, before the kneading, before the baking, before the first bite. It starts with sacks of flour crammed into damp lockers, tucked under bunks, and piled precariously around torpedoes. Flour, after all, is just dust. Dust with ambition. But keeping it edible under the ocean's crushing pressure is its own story. Picture it. Burlap sacks stacked like sandbags, each carefully marked. The air is damp, the steel walls sweat condensation, and salt clings to everything. Flour doesn't love this. It clumps, it spoils, it molds. And yet, somehow, the cooks keep it alive. You crouch and tap one of the bags, and it feels heavier than it should, not just because of the weight, but because of what it represents. The possibility of fresh bread weeks into a patrol. One mainstream fact: submarines had to be clever with storage. The U.S. Navy designed compartments with every cubic inch in mind. Flour sacks weren't just shoved anywhere. They were arranged to balance weight, and sometimes even used as insulation against the hull. On the very first days of patrol, crews might even stack food in showers or hallways until supplies dwindled enough to reclaim the space. Imagine brushing your teeth beside a sack of rye flour. It happened. And here's the quirky tidbit. Flour became currency. Sailors traded favors over it. Need an extra hour of bunk time? Maybe the cook owes you a roll if you help haul flour sacks when the boat rocks. On one German U-boat, crewmen allegedly snuck flour to trade with local fishermen during a rare coastal resupply, swapping it for fish that broke the monotony of tinned rations. Bread wasn't just bread. It was bargaining power. You run your fingers through the fine powder spilling from a small tear in one sack. It coats your skin instantly, clinging in the damp. In the back of your mind, you wonder, How on earth does this stay usable down here? That's where preservation tricks come in. Cooks guarded against mold by keeping sacks off the floor on small wooden pallets. Others swore by mixing fresh flour with slightly stale stock to stretch supplies. And sometimes, despite their best efforts, you ended up with sour loaves no amount of butter could disguise. Historians still argue whether navies truly mastered submarine food preservation, or if crews just made do with luck and improvisation. Some veterans say the system was airtight, others laugh and admit that half the flour went bad anyway. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. Orderly ledgers on paper, chaotic reality in practice, and yet, even flawed flour could be useful. Too damp to bake? Mix it into soups as thickener? Too moldy to risk? Some cooks supposedly dried it near the oven, scraping off the worst and pretending nothing happened. One sailor later confessed he suspected the biscuits on his boat were made from salvaged flour, but nobody cared. They ate them anyway. Hunger erases squeamishness. Storage wasn't just about flour, though. Look closer, and you see sugar tins, coffee canisters, and yeast bricks tucked into corners. Together, these formed the holy trinity of baking. Each was guarded fiercely. Run out of coffee, and morale dipped. Run out of sugar, and men grumbled. But run out of flour? That was disaster. It meant the ovens would go silent, and silence in the galley was worse than silence in sonar. One strange superstition grew from this dependence. Crews whispered that if a flour sack split open mid-patrol, it foretold mechanical trouble ahead. Maybe it was coincidence. Bags rip easily, and submarines always had problems, but the rumor stuck. Some cooks even tied charms or lucky knots into the strings holding the sacks, hoping to ward off bad luck. Imagine carrying torpedoes and depth charges into battle, yet fearing a flour spill the most. The irony, of course, is that flour, for all its fragility, also symbolized resilience. Stored in secret corners, surviving damp and pressure, it was proof that life could persist in hostile environments. Scientists even studied such storage years later. Intrigued by how microbes behaved in confined, recycled air. Could yeast spores survive extreme pressure? Could flour resist mold longer than expected? Experiments continue, with no clear consensus. Historians and scientists alike still argue about how submarine galleys managed what seemed impossible. You picture the cook hauling a sack, sweat dripping as the submarine tilts. The weight digs into his shoulders, flour dust exploding into the air like ghostly smoke. Sailors cheer him on, partly mocking, partly grateful. Each bag moved safely as another promise of bread tomorrow. Each sack lost to spoilage is a small tragedy. Down here, every crumb matters. And you realize something else. On land, storage is mundane. You toss flour in a pantry, forget about it. But underwater, storage becomes survival. Every sack is a gamble against dampness, against time, against hunger. Each loaf baked later is a victory not just of yeast and oven, but of careful planning weeks earlier, when supplies were first packed aboard. You pat the nearest sack gently, like it's a sleeping dog, and step back into the corridor. The flour waits in silence, patient, enduring, biding its time until the galley calls for it. Somewhere above, destroyers patrol, hunting. Somewhere ahead, the sea stretches endlessly. But here, in the hidden belly of the submarine, you know there's a quiet reserve of hope stacked in burlap, waiting to be reborn as bread. You make your way back toward the galley, brushing against the flour dust that clings to the air like mist, and notice the most mysterious ingredient of all waiting on a tiny shelf: yeast. At first glance, it looks unassuming. Small bricks or jars, carefully sealed, often tucked into tins to keep the damp out. But this humble organism is the true lifeblood of submarine baking. Without it, bread becomes nothing more than hard biscuits. With it, dough rises like hope in a place where everything else feels pressed down by the ocean above. You watch the cook pinch a bit of yeast between his fingers, sprinkling it into a bowl of warm water. It fizzles faintly. Alive? And suddenly you realize just how precarious this magic is down here. Yeast is a living thing, a colony of microscopic fungi, and it doesn't always enjoy submarine life. Humidity makes it sluggish, heat wakes it up too quickly, and recycled air seems to confuse it. Some loaves emerge proudly domed, others collapse into sad pancakes. The crew teases the cook mercilessly either way, but you can feel the tension every time. Will the yeast rise today? One mainstream fact to anchor you. Navies in World War II experimented with different yeast forms for submarines. Active dry yeast became the favorite because it stored better, though fresh yeast was sometimes carried in small quantities at the start of a patrol. German U-boats, fond of dense rye loaves, often relied on sourdough starters, a hearty tradition passed down from bakers on land. Imagine that, a submarine captain worrying not only about torpedoes, but about keeping a jar of bubbling sourdough alive in the dark. The quirky tidbit? Yeast occasionally misbehaved spectacularly. On one American submarine, a starter left too close to a warm engine vent ballooned out of its jar and oozed across the counter, like something from a horror movie. The crew called it the blob and swore it was trying to escape into the torpedo room. Another tale tells of a cook who accidentally used too much yeast, producing loaves so airy they crumbled to dust when sliced. The men still ate them, mixed into coffee. Of all things, dunked bread. Underwater edition. Historians still argue whether yeast truly suffered under pressure, or if the stories are exaggerations told by bored sailors. Some scientific experiments suggest yeast can tolerate surprisingly high pressure, even thriving in environments that mimic the deep ocean. Others point out that the combination of heat, recycled carbon dioxide, and humidity likely made it unpredictable. The truth may never be clear, but the mystery only adds to the legend of submarine bread. You lean closer, watching the dough bubble faintly in its bowl. It's alive, and that's the strange comfort. It's a living companion in this otherwise mechanical, metal world. Everything around you is steel, gears, pipes, and gauges. Yet here is a fragile colony of organisms, working quietly, turning flour into bread. In a way, it mirrors the crew itself. Small, trapped in a confined environment, surviving together under pressure. There's also the ritual of proofing dough. Picture the cook draping a towel over a bowl, tucking it into the warmest corner of the galley. Space heaters, engine heat, even body warmth, all were stolen to coax yeast into action. Sailors joked about nanny duty, guarding the dough like an infant. Some swore by tapping the bowl for luck. Others insisted on total silence so the yeast wouldn't get scared. Rational? Not at all. But in the deep, superstition fills every crack science can't reach. You catch the scent of fermenting dough now, slightly sweet, slightly sour. It weaves into the submarine's air, clashing with diesel and metal, yet somehow softening them. Sailors drift by, noses twitching, offering sly comments. Looks like it's rising better than Jenkins on watch. Bet it sinks faster than we do. Humor again, baked right into the process. And when yeast fails, desperation sparks creativity. Some crews invented quick breads using baking powder instead of yeast. They churned out loaves dense as bricks, flavored with anything they could find: powdered milk, mashed potatoes, even canned fruit juice. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept morale afloat. Imagine biting into a roll flavored faintly of pineapple juice, 200 feet under the sea. Not quite Hawaiian bread, but close enough. As the cook checks the dough, you feel the crew's anticipation rise alongside it. Men pretend they don't care, but every glance toward the galley gives them away. Yeast has become a silent barometer of mood. If the dough grows, so do spirits. If it collapses, well, expect grumbling. Even the captain peeks in sometimes, though he masks it as a routine inspection. No one is fooled. You find yourself staring at the bowl, hypnotized by the slow swell of the dough. It's strangely soothing, this gentle growth in a place defined by confinement. The yeast doesn't care about torpedoes or sonar. It just does what it has always done for humans, transforming grain into something nourishing, something shared. And as you lean back against the steel wall, it dawns on you. The greatest victory here isn't sinking enemy ships or dodging destroyers. It's coaxing life out of yeast, day after day, under impossible circumstances. It's proof, quite literally, that survival isn't just about endurance. It's about the small, living miracles that remind you you're still human. You're deep inside the steel belly of a submarine, and though the walls are just a few inches of metal between you and the crushing sea, what catches your attention isn't the pressure, it's the smell. A faint sweetness lingers, the ghost of yeast and flour in the air. By now, after weeks below, that smell is as valuable as gold. It's proof that flour sacks are still stacked in storage, that yeast is still alive, and that bread is still possible even this far under the surface. You start noticing how carefully the crew has rationed every single grain, treating the supplies as if they were currency. In a way, they are. A loaf baked today means fewer meals of dried biscuits tomorrow, and fewer mutinous stomachs growling in the night. Food on submarines during the early 20th century was never luxurious. Canned meat, powdered milk, tins of beans, these were the standards. Yet somehow, the galley still managed to guard its flour like a dragon with treasure. Part of it was psychological. Bread meant normalcy. The crew might accept tinned corned beef for dinner, but without bread, something felt missing, like the comfort of home was slipping further into the abyss. In some navies, bakers were ordered to keep flour under lock and key, and not just because rats, or occasionally cockroaches, were eager guests. Sailors could become resentful if they suspected someone was getting a thicker slice. Historians still argue whether disputes over bread rations caused minor mutinies on French subs during World War I, but the rumors alone were enough to make officers paranoid. Flour rationing wasn't just about math, it was about morale. Each bag represented dozens of loaves, and each loaf stretched the crew's patience just a little further. You imagine sailors bartering with half slices the way prisoners trade cigarettes, making quiet deals. You take my bread tonight, I'll cover your watch tomorrow. It sounds absurd, but down here, time and bread were both elastic currencies. There were practical problems too. Moisture seeped into everything in a submarine. Flour could clump, mildew, or even sprout tiny infestations if not carefully managed. The galley crew learned tricks like hanging sacks in mesh nets away from the floor, or rotating them daily to prevent damp corners. In a few submarines, sailors would swear the flour tasted of engine grease, because the smell of diesel and oil worked its way into everything. Even food supplies. Imagine biting into a slice and feeling like you've just chewed on a spark plug. Delicious. Of course, yeast was the bigger challenge. Unlike flour, yeast was alive. It needed warmth, sugar, and a bit of attention to thrive. A careless week of storage could kill it, and then, poof, no bread. Some submarine cooks became part-time scientists, tending their yeast cultures like pets. One old naval anecdote tells of a baker who named his starter Henry and fed it carefully every day, even when the boat rocked violently during depth charge practice. He claimed the yeast liked the vibrations, though historians still argue whether that was sailor humor or genuine belief. Either way, Henry produced reliable loaves, and that was all that mattered. The psychology of bread rationing became so intense that commanders sometimes used it as leverage. Extra slices were handed out as rewards for endurance, good performance, or surviving a particularly tense patrol. "You get the crusty end of the loaf tonight" could be spoken like a medal. And yes, before you ask, some sailors actually fought over who got the crust, the heel of the bread. On land, maybe kids groan when offered it, but under 200 feet of seawater, the crust meant texture, crunch, something different from the endless soft monotony of other food. Bread also carried symbolic weight beyond taste. It reminded sailors of rituals back home, church services, family meals, bakeries on city corners. The submarine crew didn't just want food, they wanted continuity. And so, guarding the bread supply became a ritual of its own. Crew members would quietly watch the galley, keeping count of flour sacks like auditors. The baker knew he was being monitored, and though no one openly accused anyone of theft, the tension was always there, like a silent ledger in everyone's head. Sometimes, things went wrong. A ruined batch, say, dough that didn't rise properly, or a loaf burnt by uneven heating, could send ripples through the boat. Suddenly, morale dipped. Whispers spread. "The yeast is dead." Or worse, "We're running out." For men already sleep-deprived, hot, and constantly aware of their mortality, the loss of bread felt like the loss of hope. Psychologists today might call it displacement, projecting broader anxieties onto a smaller, tangible object. But to the sailors, it wasn't theory. It was their breakfast. And still, despite the rationing, despite the tension, despite the occasional moldy sack or collapsed loaf, bread persisted. Somehow, there was always just enough to keep going. A slice here, a heel there, carefully measured and passed along. It wasn't abundance. It was survival, wrapped in a crust. You start to see why, when sailors later told stories of life beneath the waves. They didn't only talk about torpedoes or storms. They talked about bread, the humble constant in a world that wanted to crush them from every angle. As you picture it now, you realize that each loaf was more than calories. It was proof that the submarine could outlast its own hunger, that life could continue under impossible conditions. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the story of bread on submarines has survived. Because when men were pressed into the deep, it was bread that kept them tethered to the surface. The clang of the metal hatch echoes above you, muffled by layers of steel and water pressing from every side. Inside, the submarine has settled into its steady rhythm, the faint thrum of the diesel engines, the rhythmic sigh of air compressors, the quiet shuffle of men moving in cramped quarters. You've already gotten used to the smell, a peculiar cocktail of machine oil, sweat, and, strangely enough, the ghost of yesterday's bread. That last scent is not a hallucination. It lingers because, at this improbable depth, a baker's oven is firing. Think about it. You're 200 feet under the sea, in a steel tube designed for war. Yet here, someone has dared to install an oven. The logic behind it is surprisingly practical. Submariners live in close quarters for weeks or months. Morale is as vital as oxygen, and nothing lifts it quite like the smell of fresh bread. No freeze-dried rations or hard biscuits can compete with a warm crust in your hands. A loaf, pulled from the oven, does more than feed your stomach. It feeds your spirit. You picture the baker's space, barely large enough to turn around, yet fitted with trays, sacks of flour, tins of yeast, and a fiercely stubborn oven that must resist both rolling waves above and the immense pressure of the sea around. Sailors joke that the oven is more reliable than the radio when the latter cuts out, they still get their daily bread. And in many accounts, that oven becomes the heart of the submarine, not the command room, because its scent travels everywhere, defying steel walls. Here's the historical fact. U-boats in World War II were indeed equipped with compact electric ovens, specifically designed to withstand underwater service. The German Navy understood that good bread wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Sailors of other navies envied this. While American submariners survived on canned food and biscuits, German crews were tearing apart golden loaves that almost seemed defiant of the deep. Of course, with every marvel comes a downside. Quirky detail. The ovens sometimes produced so much heat and steam that the humidity inside the sub skyrocketed. Bread crust softened almost instantly, turning crisp loaves into chewy slabs. Some sailors joked they were eating underwater bagels rather than bread, though New Yorkers today might argue that's a compliment. But not all historians agree on just how practical this oven obsession was. Historians still argue whether the bread was truly as frequent as the German war diaries suggest, or whether it was more of a morale-boosting memory written after the fact. After all, space was limited. Flour had to be stored in airtight tins. Yeast needed careful tending in the warm, damp air. And every minute the oven was on, the submarine's electrical system had to juggle between cooking and powering other life-or-death equipment. So why bother? Because bread made men feel human in a place designed to make them machines. You lean against the narrow steel corridor and imagine the moment. The baker, sweating in his little station, pulls open the oven door. A golden, steaming loaf emerges. The crew gathers like children, waiting for a slice. The first cut releases that irresistible aroma, and suddenly the submarine feels less like a coffin and more like a home kitchen. If only for a moment. It's not unlike the way astronauts now bring along tortillas instead of bread. Tortillas don't crumble, don't float, and last longer. Bread on a submarine crumbled too, though not into floating bits, into sticky dough that clung to floors and uniforms. Yet, despite this nuisance, sailors preferred the mess of crumbs over the bleakness of packaged rations. And then, there's the risk factor. Baking required heat, and heat meant risk of fire. Imagine flames, even tiny ones, inside a submarine packed with fuel and munitions. The idea alone should make any sane captain scream. But instead of banning it, they trusted the oven and the baker. In a sense, every loaf was an act of calculated defiance, not just against hunger, but against the possibility of disaster. You glance at the faces of the men around you, exhausted, tense, but softening at the first bite. Bread, at sea level, is a food. Bread, 200 feet down, is a lifeline. Some sailors even claimed they could smell the bread rising through the hull, though that's probably more poetic than real. Still, imagine the absurdity. A submarine hiding beneath enemy destroyers, silent and unseen, while inside the crew munches on warm bread, trying not to crunch too loudly. It's both ridiculous and profoundly human. And that's the paradox you keep circling back to. In a war machine designed to deliver death, someone thought to bake life-giving bread. You can almost taste it yourself. Crusty on the outside, soft in the middle, still warm against your palms. The oven hums. The pressure outside doesn't care, but inside, for a fleeting hour, the world feels almost normal. The sea presses in, cold and absolute. But here inside the submarine, the crew lives by small rituals that keep the abyss at bay. You notice how bread, absurdly fragile compared to steel hulls and torpedoes, has become one of those rituals. And with rituals come innovations. Quirky, sometimes laughable, sometimes brilliant. Bread on a submarine was never uniform. Fresh loaves couldn't last forever, even in airtight tins. Within a week or two, the first signs of staleness crept in. By the third week, mold might appear, creeping green fuzz that spread like a silent invader. Submariners responded with creativity. Some scraped mold off and toasted the remains, convincing themselves it was harmless. Others joked that the fuzzy spots were simply sea seasoning. Practical? No. Morale-saving? Absolutely. In fact, records suggest that in longer patrols, sailors invented entire systems of bread triage. Fresh bread was consumed first, followed by loaves nearing staleness. Once the worst remained, the galley crew transformed them. Staling bread became bread soup, bread pudding, even fried bread cubes mixed into ersatz stews. There's an oddly medieval feel to it. You can almost picture monks in stone kitchens repurposing hard crusts centuries earlier. Only this time it was men entombed in a steel fish under the Atlantic. The ovens themselves, those stubborn little contraptions, were feats of engineering, compact, electric, designed to run without open flame. They looked almost toy-like compared to the lethal machinery around them. They couldn't bake massive loaves, only modest ones. But the size hardly mattered. A single loaf was rationed slice by slice, and sailors swore that even a thin sliver tasted like a holiday feast. But here's a twist that borders on tragic irony. Bread ovens sometimes betrayed their crews. The act of baking produced steam, and steam condensed on bulkheads, dripping like cold sweat. The added moisture worsened the submarine's already damp interior, encouraging mildew, rust, and the sour smell of wet clothes. Imagine trying to sleep on a bunk where your blanket is never quite dry, where bread scent and mildew battle for dominance in the air. It's not a bakery anymore. It's a swamp, one that breathes with every exhale of the engines. Not every navy embraced the bread experiment. British submariners often envied their German counterparts, stuck instead with canned and tinned food that could outlast anything but never inspired joy. One British sailor wrote in his diary that he would give up his next shore leave for a single slice of fresh rye. That's not exaggeration. In cramped, nerve-wracking missions, the psychological value of taste was immense. Some American subs tried small ovens, but the bulk of their diet remained canned beans, powdered eggs, and coffee strong enough to peel paint. You find yourself musing, maybe bread wasn't about nutrition at all, it was about defiance. A submarine, hunted and alone, had no right to luxuries. Yet here was bread, warm and fragrant, insisting that civilization still existed below the waves. It wasn't efficiency. It was resistance in edible form. Historians today sometimes laugh at the logistics. Flour bags took up precious storage. Yeast cultures needed monitoring like pets. An oven consumed energy that might otherwise have gone to sonar, lights, or pumps. And yet, crews pushed for it. Why? Because a man might endure cold, hunger, or fear, but not indefinitely without something familiar to remind him of home. There's also the peculiar fact that bread in submarines became a kind of currency. A sailor with access to the galley might trade an extra slice for favors, an hour of extra bunk time, a turn-skipping latrine duty, a secret pack of cigarettes. Bread became more than food. It became bargaining power. Soft and edible, yet strangely potent in the claustrophobic submarine economy. Picture the scene. A hush falls as the oven door opens. Men crowd the narrow corridor. One sailor jokes about stealing the loaf. Another guards it like treasure. The smell spreads faster than any rumor, filling every compartment. For a fleeting moment, the ocean outside, vast and merciless, doesn't matter. What matters is bread, golden and steaming, proof that life continues even here, 200 feet down, hunted and unseen. And then, always, someone asks the inevitable question: what if the enemy could smell it? The idea sounds absurd, almost comedic, but sailors whispered it nonetheless. They imagined destroyers above, sniffing for bread-scent trails like hounds. Completely impossibles, of course, but such was the paranoia bred by silence and depth charges. Humor kept the fear at bay, and bread gave them a reason to laugh. Bread was survival, but it was also theater, a performance of normality staged in the belly of war. Every loaf pulled from the oven was more than sustenance. It was an act of stubborn humanity, a small rebellion against the crushing anonymity of the sea. The submarine is not a home, though men must pretend it is. Nowhere does this illusion feel stronger than in the galley, the smallest kingdom in an already cramped empire of pipes, dials, and bulkheads. Step into it, and you find yourself inside what feels less like a kitchen and more like a cupboard with delusions of grandeur. Yet here, miracles were expected daily. A submarine galley of the Second World War could be no larger than a closet. On American boats, it often measured only 6 feet by 10. 2 men worked there at once, moving like dancers, each step choreographed lest they collide. Overhead, pipes dripped condensation. At their feet, cans of beans, flour sacks, and oil tins were crammed into every free inch of space. One could almost believe the galley existed not to cook food, but to remind sailors that ingenuity was the only path to sanity. Meals weren't served on porcelain plates, but on metal trays that clattered like weapons. Coffee mugs were tin, dented and perpetually stained. The cutlery was less about elegance and more about survival. Knives to spread peanut butter as often as to slice bread, forks bent from years of misuse. Yet sailors treasured these implements, because in a place where identity was swallowed by steel and hierarchy, a man's fork was still his fork. The menu was a study in paradox. Submarines left port loaded with astonishing quantities of fresh food. Eggs by the thousand, crates of apples and oranges, loaves of bread stacked like bricks. The early days of a patrol were feasts. Sailors might complain about monotony, but they could eat omelets, roasts, or even pies. Then, as weeks dragged on, fresh produce disappeared, bread hardened, and variety withered. Cabbages, somehow, lasted longest, strange green survivors of damp and darkness. Bananas, by contrast, ripened to mush in days, perfuming the air with sweetness that turned to rot. The cooks themselves were unsung magicians. On American subs, the cook was often among the most valued men aboard, his status eclipsing that of junior officers. Why? Because morale depended more on a decent meal than on a lecture about tactics. A clever cook could disguise canned meat as stew, whip powdered milk into passable pudding, and turn surplus bread into stuffing. Fail. And the crew muttered mutinously, convinced the cook was either lazy or secretly conspiring with the enemy. There was also the problem of balance. Every submarine was a delicate scale, and weight mattered. Load too many crates of potatoes on the port side, and the boat listed. To counteract this, food was stashed everywhere, beneath bunks, behind panels, even inside torpedo racks. Imagine waking up and realizing your mattress was balanced atop cabbages. Sailors joked that when they fired torpedoes, the galley cook had to rush to redistribute flour bags to keep the trim steady. And yet, despite the cramped quarters and the absurd logistics, food on submarines became legendary. German U-boat crews boasted about their sausage stores, long coils of wurst hanging like garlands from pipes until they shrank to dry husks. Italian submariners carried olive oil as though it were sacred, drizzling it on otherwise miserable meals. Americans clung to coffee, black and bitter, brewed by the gallon. The Japanese Navy stocked rice so zealously that entire compartments seemed more granary than war machine. Then there was the smell. The galley was a factory of aromas. Some welcome, others not. Bacon sizzling on the first day of patrol smelled like paradise. A week later, the same bacon grease, rancid and reused, filled the sub with a sour haze. The mingling of cooking odors with diesel fumes and unwashed bodies created a scent sailors could never forget. Years later, veterans swore they could close their eyes in a supermarket, catch a whiff of cabbage or canned corned beef, and be transported instantly back under the waves. The act of eating itself became ritual. Meals were scheduled with military precision, served in shifts, half the crew eating while the other half stood watch. Tables folded down from the bulkheads, collapsing after meals to make room for movement. Silence was rare. Men joked, grumbled, argued over politics, or told tall tales about women left behind. For a few minutes each day, the submarine felt less like a war machine and more like a floating dining hall. But food was not only about hunger, it was about control. In a world where sailors could not change the mission, could not escape the steel coffin, could not even step outside for air, a meal was a small domain of choice. To spoon sugar into one's coffee, to salt one's potatoes a little more heavily, these gestures were freedoms. Tiny but profound. Sometimes, though, the galley betrayed them. Electrical failures could ruin stores. Leaks could soak flour, turning it to cement-like paste. Worst of all was the odor of spoiled meat, an unmistakable stench that no amount of cooking could disguise. A single bad batch could poison half a crew, weakening them when stealth demanded strength. These were not merely inconveniences, they were hazards of war. And yet, through it all, the submarine galley remained a miracle of persistence. It was not elegant, not efficient, but it worked. Men lived, fought, and sometimes died with the taste of its meals on their tongues. To historians, the galley seems a footnote in naval architecture. To the sailors, it was the beating heart of survival. For if the submarine was a coffin, then the galley was its hearth. You wake again to that sound you've gotten used to. Low clanks, water dripping somewhere, the constant hum of engines. By now, you almost don't notice it. The same way people in old apartments tune out the radiator banging like a ghost with bad rhythm. But here, the noise carries weight. It's a reminder that you are deep below, inside a long steel tube, and the air around you is precious. And in this confined world, even the act of mixing flour and yeast becomes a test of patience, precision, and morale. The submarine's baker, usually a cook doubling up on duties, has one rule: don't waste flour, water, yeast, salt, maybe a drizzle of oil if luck favors you. Everything is measured out carefully. There's no such thing as, oops, I spilled the flour bag. Drop too much, and you're basically throwing away part of the crew's comfort supply. So you watch as he scoops, smooths, and weighs the ingredients, his motions slow but sure. The yeast goes in last, those tiny granules like specks of life ready to work their quiet magic. Here's a mainstream fact that still surprises people. Yeast is technically alive, and on these subs, it sometimes had to be rehydrated carefully because improper storage meant losing your chance for fluffy bread. Some navies kept a backup. Packets of compressed yeast bricks, looking more like strange soap bars than food. And when those ran out? Well, sailors were known to get creative, even scraping the last bits of sediment from previous dough batches to jumpstart the next rise. Historians still argue whether this counts as good resourcefulness or borderline desperation. Personally, I'd call it bread necromancy. And think about the water. Every drop used for bread is one less for washing or drinking. That's the trade-off. You, standing in that tiny galley, almost feel guilty watching the baker pour. There's a splash, a stir, and suddenly the smell shifts. Damp flour, sharp salt, earthy yeast. The submarine hum keeps going, but now your senses focus on the sound of kneading. Soft thuds against the counter as dough is folded and pressed. The dough itself becomes a kind of mascot for the crew. When it's sitting under its cloth to rise, the men glance at it the way passengers peek at a pet carrier on a long trip. Is it alive? Is it growing? Will it turn out okay? In that pressurized world, even a lump of flour feels like a fragile companion. Quirky tidbit here. In some patrols, sailors gave names to their dough batches. One diary records Big Frank as a sourdough starter traveling across 2 missions. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, naming your yeast blob, but when you're underwater for weeks, you'll anthropomorphize anything. Time is the real challenge. Rising dough wants warmth, but subs are often damp and cool. The cook tucks the bowl near a warm pipe, like tucking a baby in near a radiator. He wipes his hands, waits, and everyone else pretends not to hover. You catch yourself glancing at the bowl too, as though something mythical is happening under that dish towel. Then comes shaping. The cook rolls the soft dough out on a tiny floured board, forming loaves not by artistry, but by what fits into the submarine oven. Here's where another debate sparks. Some accounts say submarine loaves were always stubby, almost brick-like, while others claim bakers managed neat, rounded loaves even in that cramped setup. Historians still argue whether the shape mattered more for morale or efficiency. After all, bread isn't just bread. It's about memory, about what home tastes like. As the loaves rest for a final proof, the crew gets restless. There's a superstition growing, unspoken but strong. Don't jinx it. Don't say that bread looks good before it bakes. Don't tap the bowl too hard. Don't whistle at the wrong pitch. Submarine bread takes on this aura, a little sacred, a little absurd. If it fails, morale dips like a sonar ping swallowed by static. Finally, the baker slides the loaves into the oven. The door shuts with a metallic thud, and heat radiates out. The smell begins to bloom, warm, yeasty, comforting, curling through the narrow passageways like incense in a medieval chapel. Men nearby close their eyes just to breathe it in. For a moment, even the hum of the engines feels secondary. You stand there too, feeling how dough and heat and waiting can turn steel corridors into something that almost resembles a kitchen at home. Bread rising and baking in a submarine. At first, it feels like a small miracle. Then you realize it actually is. When the oven timer ticks down, the air thickens into something so heavy with anticipation you'd think treasure was about to be revealed. The baker cracks open the door, and steam gushes out. It fogs his glasses, curls into the room, and spreads a smell that feels almost medicinal. That first sharp hit of baked yeast and crust doesn't just fill lungs, it fills gaps in memory. 2. For a second, every sailor's brain runs homeward, to kitchens with squeaky floors, to Sunday mornings when parents carved into fresh loaves, to the neighbor's bakery, where the window frosted from winter breath. All those memories condensed into golden brown. Here's where the history books get playful. Some navies wrote rules about who got the first slice. On American subs in World War II, the captain often received it, a symbolic gesture that he, like the bread, represented the survival of the crew. In other accounts, the cook insisted on handing the end piece, the heel, to the lowest-ranking sailor as a kind of ritual, the humblest cut for the humblest rank, but always first, always fresh. Historians love to debate this, whether bread became a hierarchy symbol or whether sailors were just desperate enough to make any ritual seem sacred. The slices themselves were thick, uneven, and dangerously hot. Fingers got scorched, tongues too. But no one cared. The sound of crust cracking under a knife felt like a choir warming up. And when the first bite hit, imagine a mouth that's only known stale crackers for a week suddenly remembering softness, warmth, chew, and flavor. You'd swear the submarine tilted with how fast men leaned forward, hands out, begging for their share. What's fascinating is that bread in subs often became currency. Sailors traded crusts for favors, polishing gear, standing an extra 5 minutes of watch, even swapping bunk space. One historian dug up a diary where a man swapped his bread slice for a turn on the sub's one phonograph record player. Another report mentions bread traded for a few puffs of someone else's rare cigarette. In that sealed-off world, bread wasn't just food, it was barter. Status. A little empire of its own. Of course, baking on subs wasn't always triumphant. There were disasters. Ovens that scorched loaves black on the outside while leaving dough raw in the center. Dough that refused to rise and came out like lead weights. Flour infested with weevils, where sailors picked out the wriggling bits and baked anyway. The memoirs don't hold back on this. Brick loaves that cracked teeth. Worm bread that had to be swallowed fast. Grease rolls so oily they left stains on uniforms. Failures weren't just culinary. They became jokes, legends even, to be retold in mess halls for years. Still, in those moments when it worked, bread was almost spiritual. The submarine, normally a place of rank and discipline, softened during bread hour. Men talked more freely, laughed louder, even shared secrets they wouldn't whisper in silence patrols. Bread didn't just bind ingredients, it bound people. That's why so many memoirs, decades later, still pause to describe the smell, the taste, the quiet joy of tearing into a loaf hundreds of feet under the sea. Think about that for a second. In a machine designed for war, designed for destruction, inside pressure that could crush steel if the hull gave way. The act that kept men human was kneading flour and yeast. Something so fragile, so domestic, so ordinary, became their anchor. And here's the quirky twist. Some submarines had such famous bakers that captains specifically requested them for missions. Not for strategy, not for weapons expertise, for bread. Imagine being remembered not as a decorated officer, but as the man who could bake a proper loaf under the Arctic ice. That's not just history, that's mythology. By the time you've chewed through these stories, you realize submarine bread was more than calories. It was proof that life continued, that comfort could be conjured in the most unnatural place. Every slice was a reminder that even far from land, far from safety, humanity could still bloom in the shape of a loaf. And as you sit with that image, the hot crust, the steam rising, the sound of laughter threading through narrow steel corridors, you wonder, maybe bread is the closest thing to magic humans ever made. The deeper you sink into this tale, the stranger the science becomes. Bread, after all, isn't just nostalgia. It's chemistry, biology, and physics, all working together in the least likely laboratory. A submarine kitchen? Think of it, yeast, those tiny living organisms, had to survive in sealed tins, waiting months before being awakened in water. Sailors called it bringing the bugs back to life, in a place where men were trained to kill engines, silence weapons, and extinguish every hint of light. They were also tasked with coaxing microscopic fungi to breathe again. Humidity posed another problem. A submarine's atmosphere was thick, damp, and laced with diesel fumes, sweat, and recycled air. Yeast thrived too well sometimes, bubbling over and turning dough sour before it could be shaped. Other times, the humidity condensed on ceilings, dripping into bowls and ruining the mixture. A memoir from a British sub during the Cold War tells of a baker who swore he had to dodge the ceiling rain as he kneaded. He wasn't exaggerating. Condensation really did fall in steady drops, as if the boat itself was weeping into the bread. Temperature was its own cruel riddle. Too hot, and yeast died instantly. Too cold, and dough sulked, refusing to rise. Submariners invented hacks, wrapping bowls in wool blankets stolen from bunks, propping them against engine room bulkheads for warmth, or even holding dough close to their own chests beneath uniforms. Imagine a hardened sailor, covered in grease and salt, cradling a lump of dough like it was a baby. If history sounds tender here, it's because tenderness really happened. Then there was salt. Submarine kitchens often had to use desalinated seawater, which didn't behave like fresh water from land. Its mineral content sometimes made bread rise oddly, or gave crusts a strange aftertaste. One experiment in the 1960s tried deliberately adding back minerals to make the bread taste normal. The report dryly notes, "Results unsatisfactory." Translation: the bread came out tasting like rusted bolts. Flour storage carried its own risks. Locked away in steel bins, it attracted pests even in the ocean's depths. Weevils, mites, even the occasional cockroach. Sailors invented sieving rituals, shaking flour through fine mesh and picking out the dark specks. Some joked that extra protein improved morale, but others swore those specks haunted their dreams. The irony is rich. A submarine could sneak beneath radar, evade sonar, survive depth charges, and still lose its dignity to insects in the flour. And yet, science also delivered miracles. Carbon dioxide from yeast wasn't just gas trapped in dough bubbles. It was life, breath, expansion, a visual reminder that something alive could grow even in confinement. Watching dough rise was watching proof of hope. Historians point out that psychological studies during wartime confirmed this. Men on submarines who baked showed reduced stress and improved group cohesion. That is, bread literally saved minds. The ovens, crude as they were, became centers of innovation. Some were repurposed from old oil-fueled heaters. Others jury-rigged electric boxes barely large enough to hold 2 pans. Sailors modified timers, lined walls with scavenged sheet metal, and used engine heat as pre-warmers. The ingenuity rivals any wartime invention, though these inventions didn't make weapons. They made crust. Even mishaps taught lessons. Dough spilled on hot pipes produced sweet-smelling steam that disguised the stench of diesel. Overbaked loaves could be crumbled into crumbs to thicken soups. Failed bread was recycled into puddings with condensed milk, sugar, and raisins when supplies allowed. Nothing went to waste. Bread's science wasn't just in chemistry, it was in adaptation, the art of transforming failure into sustenance. What's striking is how many submariners later described baking as the one act that felt like defiance. Against pressure, against isolation, against monotony, they still made something warm, fragrant, alive, in the belly of machines designed for cold logic. Bread whispered of hearths and hands and humanity. One sailor wrote, "Every loaf was a rebellion against steel." That line still lingers in naval archives, a kind of accidental poetry etched into history. So when you picture submarine bread now, don't just imagine crusts and crumbs. Imagine yeast fighting damp air. Imagine sailors cradling dough for warmth. Imagine loaves serving as experiments in survival, in both body and mind. And perhaps most of all, imagine the paradox. In the most hostile environment humans ever built, the softest, simplest food survived, and in doing so, carried humanity forward, slice by slice. By now, the story of submarine bread feels almost mythic, but its consequences stretch far beyond nostalgia. When navies realized just how central bread was to morale, they began formal experiments. The U.S. Navy, in the 1950s and 60s, ran food trials on diesel subs to test whether fresh bread could truly change performance. The findings were oddly specific. Crews who had daily bread showed fewer arguments, better focus during drills, and, curiously, lower reports of claustrophobic agitation. In plain words, bread helped men stop snapping at one another. Psychologists explained it with olfactory anchors. Smells, especially comforting ones, can stabilize mood and memory. Bread baking on a submarine meant that, for at least 1 hour, the air smelled not of oil, sweat, and fear, but of warmth and grain. A British scientist quipped, "It was therapy," without them knowing it was therapy. Even more surprising was the recognition of bread as a timekeeper. On land, days are measured by sunrises, sunsets, clocks, and calendars. In a submarine, all of that collapses. Sailors lived by shifts and watches, in cycles of 4 or 6 hours, with no light to tell them if it was morning or midnight. Bread stepped into this void. Dough rising became a clock. It'll be ready in 3 hours. Ovens set a rhythm. Bread's out by change of watch. A French submarine veteran recalled, "We marked our days by loaves, not by hours." This quiet role of bread as calendar, as compass, is what historians now call culinary chronometry. It's obscure, but haunting. Bread told time when the world above could not. There's also the symbolism of bread as civilization itself. Anthropologists argue that when humans first baked bread thousands of years ago, it marked the shift from wandering to settling, from foraging to building. Bread was permanence. So in the fleeting, shifting, unstable space of submarines, baking bread was like planting a flag of humanity. A reminder, we are not just machines in the deep, we are still people who bake. Interestingly, this recognition spread beyond war. In the 1970s, as nuclear submarines became capable of staying submerged for months, planners debated whether bread baking should be replaced entirely by freeze-dried rations. On paper, it made sense: less storage, less labor, more efficiency. But trials revealed crews sank into gloom when bread disappeared. Veterans reported higher rates of what they bluntly called cabin depression. The Navy backtracked. Bread stayed. Bread, then, was more than carbohydrate. It was culture, psychology, and ritual all wrapped into one. A slice of submarine bread wasn't just eaten, it was shared. Crews cut loaves and passed them hand to hand, dividing equally, ensuring everyone got warmth. The act mirrored communion in churches or breaking bread in family kitchens. It said, "Without words, we are together in this steel coffin, and we will endure it together." Some loaves gained legendary status. There are anecdotes of birthday bread, where sailors pooled sugar rations to sweeten dough for one lucky comrade. Others recall peace bread, a loaf baked the moment news of war's end reached the crew, tears mixing with laughter as they sliced it. Bread was no longer just food. It became message, symbol, ceremony. The echoes reach even into today. Modern submarines, armed with nuclear weapons and digital systems, still bake bread. Crews aboard Ohio-class or Vanguard-class boats describe the same aroma winding through steel corridors, the same hush as loaves emerge from ovens, the same anchoring of the human spirit. Some things refuse to change, even when technology gallops ahead. It is strange, isn't it, that in the heart of 20th century war, in the belly of machines designed for destruction, Survival hinged not only on steel, sonar, and torpedoes, but also on yeast, flour, and salt. That humanity found its footing in a loaf. That bread became, in its quiet way, as essential to victory as strategy. And perhaps, strangest of all, that this fragile ritual continues even now, whispered forward through generations of sailors who know, without needing to be told, that no submarine is complete without bread. So what are we to make of this odd, submerged chronicle of bread? At first glance, it seems almost absurd. Men in steel beasts, hurtling silently through the dark oceans, armed with weapons powerful enough to end the world, yet pausing each day to knead dough, wait for yeast, and slice loaves. It is one of those truths so simple it becomes profound. In a way, Submarine Bread reveals a secret about human endurance. Survival is never just about calories or technology. It is about meaning. A warship could be perfectly engineered. A submarine could be stocked with fuel, torpedoes, and charts. But without bread, without that soft reminder of life above, the crew risked losing the invisible battle of the mind. This is why historians now whisper that bread was a hidden weapon. Not one fired in anger, but one needed in silence. Bread held men together in the deep, stopped tempers from flaring, gave rhythm to the timeless dark, and kept the soul tethered to home. When sailors remembered the war, they remembered torpedoes, yes, but they also remembered the smell of warm loaves drifting through a steel corridor. And so, the strange science of submarine bread is less about baking and more about humanity. It teaches us that in the most extreme conditions, under crushing water, in endless night, what sustains us is not just strength, but softness, not just machinery, but ritual, not just strategy, but the small comfort of sharing something warm and alive. As you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself aboard such a vessel. The ocean presses in, vast and eternal. The hull hums, the air is tight, and then, there it is. The quiet knock of the cook, the sliding open of a hatch, and the smell of bread rising in the gloom. For a moment, the sea doesn't matter. For a moment, you are human again. Close your eyes and carry that image with you. The deep ocean outside, endless and cold, the warm loaf inside, fragile and fleeting. Between them lies survival. Between them lies the secret of submarine bread. Good night, and may your dreams be as warm and steady as a freshly baked loaf, carrying you gently through the silent depths of sleep.